Welcome to the Family Business Audiocast on LinkedIn. I am R. Adam Smith, creator of this audiocast series. As an entrepreneur, investor, founder, investment banker, and board leader the last 25 years, I'm fortunate for my many experiences within the family firm industry. A warm thank you to our live audience on LinkedIn today and for those listening in the future. A brief comment on why I created this broadcast. Private companies are a passion of mine, having grown up in a family of entrepreneurs and having engaged for 2 decades in deals, strategic transformations, investments, and boards with an array of fascinating family enterprises, family firms, and family offices. I founded this series to offer a useful platform for listeners to hear from veterans, academics, and leaders in the vast family firm ecosystem. Whether you're a family business owner, building, running, or advising a family office, or just expanding your family office activities, I hope these conversations are useful and enlightening. And now it's time to turn our attention to our accomplished guests on today's episode. Welcome to the Family Business Audiocast. I'm Artem Smith, creator of this Audiocast series, and a warm thank you to our live audience today and those listening in the future. Today, I'm pleased to host Henry Brandts-Giesen, who is the global co-chair of the Dentons family office and the High Net Worth Group. Henry, it's really great to have you on the show finally. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. Really privileged to be here. I'm a big fan of your show, and I'm glad we've been able to make this happen. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to talk about you briefly, and then we'll dig in. Henry is general counsel and a strategic advisor to family offices, investors, and foreign multifamily offices, as well as trust companies, family businesses, private fund managers, philanthropists, and grant makers. He is at Dentons, as I mentioned, one of the world's largest and most prestigious law firms. Henry is jurisdictionally neutral and operates globally to develop global strategies to provide solutions for clients from within the Dentons platform, primarily focused on the global family office community. He is particularly focused on wealth management planning, family office design and governance, family business succession, trust law, fiduciary risk management, foreign direct investment, cross-border wealth structuring, and the whole range of family office and family wealth and family firm planning, which is an area, of course, that we are extremely involved in and excited to speak with him about. Today, we're going to speak really about Asia and the emerging giant, next field of the family office and family enterprise. In terms of Asia, like Asia with the explosion of wealth out of Singapore, as well as China and South Korea, and then secondarily Taiwan and Australia and Japan, it's really stepping into a powerful moment. Can you just talk a little bit about that? The transformation of wealth of Asia, let's say going back to the last couple of decades, and like where does that bring us to today in terms of acceleration, particularly Singapore, and how do you compare that to the European family office landscape?
It's a great question, Adam. And the thing is, I've worked all over the world. I practiced in Europe for the first half of my career, and I've done a lot of work with US family offices over the years and even into Africa. But one thing that's really struck me about sort of the evolution of private wealth in Asia is just the remarkable speed at which it's unfolded. Now, that's not to say that, of course, there's been private wealth in Asia for millennia. And of course, when we're talking about Asia, we're talking about a very large, diverse area. So it's unfair to generalize, but to some extent we can and we have to. But if we just look back, say, in the last 100 years, there's been a remarkable development story there, and it continues to unfold with complexity and dynamism. Asia's journey from post-war recovery to becoming a global epicenter for private wealth is really nothing short of extraordinary. And that's been driven by demographic shifts, economic shifts, and regulatory changes, which have sort of defined and refined the landscape of private wealth in Asia. And I think that probably the catalyst for that was probably the aftermath of the Second World War, when much of Asia was devastated and quite uncertain. Countries like in North Asia, like Japan and South Korea, faced reconstruction. Their response was one of quite resilience and ambition. We all, I think, know and are familiar with the Japanese economic miracle from the 50s to the 80s, when Japan really...
I did my thesis on that in college at Boston University, actually, the rise of the Asian mix and the Japanese post-World War recovery. But now Singapore is really at the forefront, no?
Well, Singapore is absolutely at the forefront. I mean, when I started my career, Singapore was a bit of a new frontier, I suppose, for private wealth management. Places like New York and London and Switzerland, they were the places where wealth was intermediated, where it was managed and capital was deployed. And Singapore was still a frontier jurisdiction, but now it's very much a hub, not just for Asia, but I'd say it's also attracting capital from regions as well, from Europe and the US too. And that's a remarkable success story, really driven by the vision of a leader and implementing policies, tax incentives, regulations to become a sophisticated city state with world-class infrastructure, rule of law, and highly educated people.
True. Super impressive. I do recommend family offices that are global or interested in cross-border investing, FDI, and investing in Asia, or let's say have family or businesses in Asia. Definitely consider Singapore, given the latest jurisdictional rulings and changes. And as you said, the rule of law is very strong there. And they're just very friendlier from a jurisdictional tax perspective. Moving into the generational shifts, you obviously cover a lot of family offices that have multi-generational elements to them and the complexities, which result in planning from a legal perspective, governance, next gen, trust and estates, generation skipping trust, allocations of wealth, succession dynamics. It's a very heavy topic. What are some of the more fun or enjoyable elements of that advisory side of more big complex families? Like, what are some of the enjoyable elements of those relationships and projects?
I think the enjoyable element of it is this great opportunity that we have to add value to families, and then those families add value to the communities in which they live and the countries in which they operate. And that's just the opportunity to take them from a sort of a founder office, if you like, to a family office. So a lot of the wealth that's been created in the last 70 to 80, 100 years is relatively young, and when compared to places like Europe and the US. And so they haven't gone through that intergenerational transition. And even the advisory networks and the ecosystems around them haven't really done that either. So I think the fun aspect of that is the education that we can do, the case studies, the comparisons we can provide with other parts of the world, and also the local exemplars as well. It's not to say that the area is underserved or unsophisticated. It's just that there's quite a diversity. And I think the opportunity we have and the fun part is to level up and to take these founder offices to sibling partnerships and cousin confederations. As with any family, there's fun and there's challenges, there's emotion, and there's a real sort of excitement with that. But if not carefully managed, it can often lose momentum and conflicts can arise as well. So there's both fun and challenge with all of that.
Now, it's certainly complex, and I've seen this as I plan for families in M&A to buy or sell assets in my current role or previously investment banking. Is like the emotional and financial and tax complexities in a sale it filters through the entire family, right? And it creates conflict and tension and jealousy and ego and pride. It's very complicated. But the good news is that you guys as lawyers have to remain calm, and the work has to get done anyway. So you're in an enviable position sometimes as lawyers to, be like an essential part of the equation. Like things cannot get done without you. You mentioned the word partnership and confederations is interesting because on the Family Business Audiocast, we've had some global experts, as you know, from Christina Wing to Alfredo Damasis, Tom Deans. So we have really, really top people on the podcast. And once when we had a discussion of let's say the family dynamics, Alfredo Damasis referred to the kind of the ecosystem of the family office or the family enterprise with the word galaxy. And he actually discusses the word galaxy in his world. And I do a shout out for him to use that word. And he's using it now. We talked about it on our podcast when he started sort of using that word more holistically, more frequently, of this disparate like federation of stars of the family, which means it's very complicated. I encourage you to listen to our podcast, and like some of his recent discussions of the galaxy is kind of relate to that dispersed ecosystem that lawyers have to consider. Now, on the more, let's say, professionalization side, Dentons has one of the largest family office, client bases in the world probably, and also you have a very strong publication. There was a big piece that you guys produced. Can you talk about some of that shift going on between, let's say, single founder wealth to more like process driven wealth. And that kind of also is related to like human capital, external advice, intellectual capital, and kind of professionalizing the family office.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the work that we do, and the value that's added and actually, frankly, is needed now, not just in Asia, but in other parts of the world too, where wealth has been created in the last generation. And now the big challenge is to transition that wealth between the generations successfully and with continuity. And to me, the single most important factor in doing that successfully is family governance. That is what underpins successful wealth transitions. And family governance is essentially a system. It's a system to regulate how will a family make decisions together, how will it communicate, and how will it solve problems together. Now, there's different models of governance. Many Asian families, they will be quite principle directed, so that the founder will be directing things. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all. And many families around the world operate very successfully like that. That is a legitimate system of governance, but it's not a sustainable one because, of course, principals and founders, they die or they lose capacity. And so I think to ensure sustainability, other systems of governance need to be explored. That's when we start talking about governance bodies like family councils, family boards, the use of outside directors to make strategic decisions, manage disputes. There's no one size sort of fits all or one perfect model. Each governance structure needs to be customized for the family. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this is all part of one of the major steps, I think, in the professionalization of family wealth, going from a sort of a principle-directed, often reactive mindset to one where actually there's more of a democratization of decision making and the benefits of the wealth. And I think the use of technology, the use of external experts in a strategic way to, first of all, define the objectives of the family and then to fulfill those objectives and to remain current and to change when needed. No system, whether it be of governance or operations, is going to be or should be static. So that's really the sort of the essence of a lot of the work we do.
That's good. When you guys are on complex cross-border global family enterprise work, I mean, those projects can last many, many months or years, right? Because you're planning taxes, cross-border, tax planning, generational transfer, further development to the concept of the children and succession planning and next gen. I do want you to think about or comment on like this amorphic next gen concept, because I have been thinking that the concept of next gen is sometimes too simplified in the family office context, because it presumes that the spotlight is on the transition to the children of next gen, G2, G3, G4, but often the next gen doesn't even want to take on the business, or they're not qualified, or both. And so the concept of next gen is really important, I think, to go beyond the actual succession into more like what's best for the company and what's best for the children. It's not necessarily for them just to keep their money and their job in the company. Is to maximize the value of the company and also to maximize the value and happiness of the children that may not be involved in the company. So what are you seeing there?
It's interesting. I mean, one of my heroes is Jay Hughes, and he avoids the term next gen. He calls it the rising gen, and I quite like that term as well, because it sort of depends on what the family's objectives are. If this family wants to be a 1,000-year family, and we have families that we advise that do, then the next gen is no more important than the generation after that, or the generation after that, or the generation after that.
Well, they also have to have a lot of babies.
Yeah. So it's more about, I think, mapping the stakeholders at the beginning of a project, understanding who are the stakeholders, and then mapping the power that they all have as well and the expectations they have, and then working out, well, how do we guide the family, guide those stakeholders through a process whereby they agree their vision and values and objectives. So that's really the very first stage of any consulting project we work on, is a real deep discovery phase before we even start to think about solutions. And obviously the rising gen are really important in that there'll be a group of them who will want to engage. There'll be others that may not. And there will be others, if we're talking about multi-generations after the next gen, who aren't represented, but we try to anticipate what it is they may be expecting from the family. And one of the challenges we have with that, I think, is that for better or worse, many of the entrepreneurs and the founders and the wealth creators are very focused, driven, and controlling people. That's often been the secret of their success. And so getting them to hand over the reins and to give up a little bit of information, a little bit more power than they may have done in the past can also be a real challenge, because especially as people are living older, living longer, some of these founders are often well into their 80s and 90s. And the next gen, if we're going to use that term in its literal sense, it may be in their 40s and 50s. And so for them, often this change hasn't, or this transition hasn't even yet started. And so we're really trying to encourage engagement between the wealth creators and the rising gen early, so that we can plan holistically and well in advance of when it's really necessary.
Nice. I like that. And moving on to beyond the financial capital is, the human capital side and the kind of broadening wealth to more social capital, like Jay Hughes and the Alternative Worth Institute talks about the total capital, if you will, family capital. They use that term very successfully at the Alternative Worth Institute. You want to talk about family capital holistically and like what that means intellectually, and let's say the soft and hard power elements that you see as you're navigating the family's challenges.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the most important things that we can add as advisors. I mean, it's been one of the most profound changes in my career, going from traditional law to consulting, is this realization, which was really taught to me by Jay Hughes, that family wealth is not just the financial capital, the money that flows from the business or the investments. There are other qualitative forms of capital, human capital, which is sort of the IP, the education, the development and health of the family members. The social capital refers to the sort of the network of relationships within the family and externally. And the spiritual capital is the shared beliefs, purpose, and ethical principles that guide decision-making and family cohesion. And then the intellectual capital, which is really the accumulated knowledge and expertise and capability that's within the family. And I think historically, lawyers and accountants that have driven this sort of advice, they've just focused on the financial capital. And we haven't really had that broader mindset until the likes of Jay Hughes and others started to write about this. And many still don't. Many advisors, consultants still don't. But what we see, we buy into the theory, the financial capital is the fuel for the other forms of family capital, the qualitative forms. And it's obviously important, but it can't be sustained without proper planning for those other forms of family capital. And that's where governance and these other things that I've spoken about earlier become so important, because it's not just about the financial capital.
I love that. Again, our podcast talking about the softer power. We've had the likes of Emily Bouchard, was it Hawthorne, Valerie Gonskaya from Merrill Lynch, Christina Wing, Richard Wolkowitz, as well as Jim Grubman. So we've talked about that softer side as well, which cannot get lost in the shuffle. Back to governance, you talk about the fundamental questions, which really drives advice into family councils, charters, advisory boards around governance. So like if you could talk about these fundamental questions of decision making, problem solving, communication, and you guys talk about this in your report as well. What are these fundamental questions you have to nail? And then give the listeners some actionable principles for family governance.
Every family has a system of governance, whether they know it or not. And I think one of the first things that we do as consultants is we try and map the stakeholders and how they decide, how they communicate and how they solve problems. Now, as I said, for many of those families, that system will be successful for a time, but for most families, that will need to evolve over time. Certainly at the moment, I think we're seeing this real trend around the world from transitioning from a principle-directed governance system to one where there are far more stakeholders that need to be considered and involved. One of the ways we do that is by setting up governance bodies like family councils or family assemblies, family boards. Now, they all have different roles, and frankly, they're not terms of art, but in my practice, we define their very carefully how you qualify for one of those roles and what is expected within those roles. But they will either be decision-making bodies in relation to capital allocation, for example, or the exercise of power. They will, or they may be advisory bodies, or they may be bodies which have rights of veto or sort of act as a judicial branch of the family. Now, the important thing really is that that system is designed with the specific family in mind and in consultation with the stakeholders. It's very easy for somebody to pull out a playbook and just implement or put a system on top of a family and say, right, off you go, use this. But it just doesn't work like that in practice, and it shouldn't. And so each system will be quite unique to the family. But certainly there are patterns that we recognize from other families that work, and we would use as exemplars and suggestions in a consulting process. But ultimately, it comes down to answering those three fundamental questions that I talked about earlier on. We must have a system, a process that's transparent and fair, which helps the family make decisions, communicate, and solve problems. If we can answer those three fundamental questions, then there's a really good chance that we can set up this family for intergenerational success.
That's very complex, and I encourage people to reach you to discuss this. Obviously on LinkedIn. Would you like them to reach you on LinkedIn or on email? What's best for you?
Well, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so always feel free to connect with me on that. And if you look me up on the Dentons website, my email address is on there as well. So very, very happy to exchange details, information, and be of service.
Okay. Now back to the family capital concept and the generational transfer. The next generation, the millennials especially, are much more interested in the softer power and softer side of wealth, including philanthropy and art and impact. So like I often talk about the social license and the social side of the family office. Can you just talk about how philanthropy and impact kind of align with this, let's say, the legitimacy, the longevity of the family office? And what are you seeing, as the system changes to incorporate philanthropy, let's say philanthropy, art, venture capital, the passion side? What's happening there?
Yeah, look, I think as we sort of open the discussion, this evolution of private wealth in Asia, that it's highly impressive, and it's lifted millions of people out of poverty and created extreme wealth in some circumstances. And that's both encouraging and positive, but it's also, I think, important that if these families are to sustain themselves and, more critically, I think, retain social license in a region which is greatly affected by wealth inequality, child poverty, declining standards in public education, healthcare, fiscal deficits, and climate change, and aging populations, and things like that, environmental challenges. I think these families do need to be thinking more than just about themselves. And often these families will be and are becoming targeted by media, politicians, and even their peers as being part of these problems rather than the solutions. So I think these families will need to start thinking about using their platform of privilege and access to help develop their communities and drive positive systems change. So I think families are starting to realize that as well. And that's part of our role as advisors, is to give them the tools. I mean, all the families I advise, they do care deeply about their communities, but often they don't know quite how they can impact positively in the most effective way. So we connect them and we guide them through that process. And that will be really important, I think, not only to do the right thing, but also to be seen to do the right thing. I think as the world becomes more polarized, we're going to need public wealth, public sector wealth, and private capital to come together to solve some of these problems. I don't think it can be done by either one of them on their own. And philanthropy is a big part of that, social impact.
I actually manage a charity around that topic of private public sector power for a stronger economy called Caring Capitalism. So we can talk about that at some point later. So let's wrap up and talk about building next generation, multi-generational bridges, and just looking at family office as a really essential societal organization, incorporating tech, AI, cybersecurity, governance technology. Just talk a bit about this importance of professionalization and what that means to the industry.
Yeah, look, I think that the term family office has proliferated, especially in Asia. And that's often been driven by, to be honest, some sort of slick marketing campaigns and tax incentives, and has led to somewhat of a mislabeling, I think, of what are essentially wealth management accounts as family offices. Now, hasn't always been helpful and can be quite confusing. But I think the good news is that some of these accounts or these family offices are evolving quite quickly, actually, in response to these issues that were spoken about earlier around succession. And I think the maturity of the advisory network to become more professionalized structures, which sort of balance in-house functionality with strategically procured outsourcing, with the aim of professionalizing family governance and institutionalizing family investment and making wealth intergenerational. And so I think technology is a big enabler in all of that, to be honest, as well as governance being the sort of the most critical aspect. I think that then is enabled by technology, whether that be through AI and or the consolidated reporting platforms, which just provide a landscape view of all the wealth without sort of requiring multiple custodian relationships. I think it can democratize wealth management to some extent by providing information and functionality which previously could only be provided by large institutions. So I think that's quite exciting, and I can see wealth tech already evolving at pace and will be an important part of solving some of these governance challenges.
Well, it's important to wrap on a positive note. I like the topics we covered today, and there's much more to think about. But the reference to governance as like a pinnacle of making everything work and being sustainable and evolutionary and living, like a living thing, is really important, and include the whole family in that, and children and lawyers and everything. I think that's often viewed as somewhat dry. I'd like you to wrap up and just also think about more the human side of it, like the more humanity side of wealth. If you might want to share a minute or two on that side of the people side, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think that's the great privilege about working in this industry, is that we are dealing with humans. It's not being an investment banker or a private equity manager or doing institutional work. We may be dealing with institutional sums of money, scale wealth, but actually, ultimately, behind all of that is a warm-blooded person or group of people who live and breathe and worry about the same sorts of things that everybody else does. And because of that, they also care that there's direct connectivity to a human mindset and belief system. When you can maintain that connection, that direct connection, then you can really, I think, make impact both quickly and positively, which possibly isn't always the case in an institution where, of course, there's a whole bunch of different stakeholders and considerations at play. So that's the great privilege of working in a family office, is that ability to connect with the human beings behind it, the agility that they have, and the ability to make decisions quickly. And I think the challenge we have, though, is to make sure that those decisions are good decisions. And as the office grows or the family grows, that there's enough process behind the decision making to make sure that it's effective and consistent with defined values and beliefs and objectives, but not so much that it corporatizes them and diminishes some of that human element.
Thank you so much for today and for sharing more about Dentons. I encourage people to learn about the law firm and about Henry's practice globally. Wonderful law firm, and he's doing a great job, and I'm very impressed with both the firm and his group. It's really great to have you here today. Thank you for finally joining on the Family Business Audiocast.
Thanks, Adam. I'm really glad we could make this work, and I'm really a big fan of the show, as I said, and appreciate everything you do for our ecosystem as well.
Thank you. I would like to thank our esteemed guest, Henry Brandts-Giesen. This is Artem Smith signing off. Please stay tuned for the next episode of the Family Business Audiocast.